Hello friends, welcome back to the channel. I have a very bizarre and fascinating story to share with you guys today that I've been meaning to cover for a while for reasons that I think will become apparent as we go through this very long and convoluted story that is the strange world of Jack Parsons. But who is Jack Parsons? Parsons was a rocket scientist, an alchemist, occultist, godfather of the space program, critical in founding the Jet Propulsion Laboratory and for advancing the early rocketry that laid the groundwork for NASA's space program, who has been all but erased from his proper place in official history. As always, of course, the truth is much stranger than fiction. Parsons was a visionary. He was very brilliant, but also a bit of a sperg. He was like an autist before that was a thing. He was an ardent follower of Aleister Crowley's Thelema, blending magic with science. He was really a magician of the nuclear age. Parsons' influence is still felt today, from space and missile technology to the esoteric New Age and UFO movements. Parsons really was the one who popularized Thelema in America, inspiring modern occultists, neo-pagans, wiccans, and chaos magicians. His fusion of science and mysticism and use of psychedelics really prefigured the psychedelic and esoteric revival of the 1960s. And a line can be drawn to the modern technocrats today who are going on these ayahuasca retreats and taking DMT and talking to techno elves. In order to really make sense of the world today, it is important to understand the past, our true history, not the sanitized version that is presented by official history, quote unquote. The story gets very strange. It's definitely not child-friendly and is certainly a cautionary tale. So we'll start at the beginning. Jack Parsons was born in Los Angeles, California on October 2nd, 1914, and we have to make a brief detour real quick to mention the famed British occultist Aleister Crowley, who I'm sure most people are familiar with and who will feature more heavily later in this story. But I wanted to note that just before Parsons is born, going back to 1904, Crowley channels via a being that he called ayahuasca something called the Book of the Law, and he begins to see himself as a prophet for what he called the Aeon of Horus, or the crowned and conquering child. And then in 1908, so just 4 years after Parsons is born, Crowley conducts a sex magic ritual called the Alamantra working with a woman named Rhodey Minor. The working, according to them, created a portal in the space between stars through which an entity known as Lamb was able to enter the known physical universe. Lamb is this creature that has a very big head. He's got tiny little eyes and a slit of a mouth and kind of like a small body. He looks like the prototypical quote-unquote gray alien that you hear about from all of these UFO stories that will pop up later on. So Crowley claimed that since then, other entities, and this is speculated, other entities are believed to enter through this portal and can maybe be explained as the basis for these contact experiences people have had with UFOs or what they perceive to be aliens. And one of the revelations of the working was apparently the symbolism of the egg. Crowley and Rhodey were told it's all in the egg. Crowley believed Lamb to be the soul of a dead Tibetan Lama from Lang between China and Tibet. Lamb is apparently Tibetan for the way or path, which Crowley said had the numerical value of 71, or no thing, being a reference to a gateway to the void and a link between the star systems of Sirius and Andromeda. He believed that Lamb was to fulfill the work initiated by ayahuasca, who he channeled this book through, this entity. But going back to Jack Parsons. So Parsons is born October 1914. His dad was Marvel Parsons and his mother was Ruth Whiteside. Jack's real name is actually Marvel Whiteside Parsons. He's named after his father. His mother, Ruth, came from a very wealthy family. His parents ended up kind of breaking up, I want to say around 2.5 years into their marriage. It's very early on. Evidently, Marvel Parsons was a bit of a womanizer and was possibly bringing ladies of the night into the house, into the family house, allegedly. Ruth left Marvel and she kicks him out of the house, but she also kicks him out of the young Jack's life. And so Jack grows up without a father, and his mother starts calling him John, and because of that, his friends will end up calling him Jack, and so this is kind of how he gets the name of Jack Parsons. Now, his father, Marvel, moves back home. He ends up joining the army. So the young Jack was raised by his mother and her rich parents. He's raised in affluence. For a while, he doesn't have to go to school. He's being homeschooled. He is living in a mansion on a massive estate on Millionaires Row in Pasadena, complete with servants. And he wears these little woolen tailored suits. He becomes a big reader. He starts devouring books, and especially science fiction books. And mind you, this is the early 1920s. There's not much else to do except read, He enjoys playing with fireworks and with his grandfather. He and his grandfather would take this black powder out in the backyard and they'd kind of try to make their own rockets. They would take apart, fireworks, and this is how the kinds of things that he would do. When it was time for the young Parsons to go to school, he's not very well liked in school by his peers. He shows up and he's this little kid, chubby little kid wearing these tailored suits, and he speaks with this fake, British accent, and this is because the servants at his house are British. So these are kind of like the people who are really raising him with his mom and his grandparents. So he's wearing the suits, he's got this weird quasi-British accent, and then he carries around these stacks of science fiction books. He's coming to school in a chauffeured limousine, and his grandfather is giving him $20 a day as his allowance. So to put this into perspective, your, hourly pay back at that time would have been 67 cents. So he's getting a lot of money. I mean, to the other kids there, that's obviously very different. So he doesn't have a lot of friends, and he doesn't really seem to be a good student either. He doesn't really excel in the school environment. It's possible he may have been dyslexic. There are theories about that. But he does make one friend who would last him a while, and that is a kid by the name of Edward Foreman. Foreman ends up coming to his aid during one of the times that he's being bullied, and the two become close. They share a love for science fiction, and Jack is, he's kind of a mama's boy at this point. He has no formal degrees. He bounces around between schools. As a boy, he's pretty lonely. He's got his mom, but than just his grandparents, and they're pretty elderly. So as a young kid, around 10 years old or so, he starts to develop a budding interest in the occult. Now, this is around the 1920s. He's reading these pulp magazines and like weird books. You know, he likes Jules Verne, H.G. Wells, and he's obsessed with science fiction. But he's also, you know, getting into the occult, and he claims at one point, at, you know, around this age, that he summoned the devil. He claims that he succeeded, or he intimates that he succeeded, and that his reaction to this was one of cowardice. He called the experience a magical fiasco. Around this time, he and Ed Foreman are doing these backyard experiments, designing gunpowder-based rockets with aluminum foil, cherry bomb fireworks, and glue. Parsons and Foreman would continue these experiments well into their 20s. These experiments with fireworks were serious, though. This need for experimentation grew, and in 1928, the pair began constructing their own solid-fueled rockets. Neighbors at the time reported that Parsons' backyard was full of scorched craters from some of these less successful rocket trials, and according to Foreman, it was at this time Parsons began experimenting with a glue that would act as a binding agent for the loose power in these DIY rockets that they're creating. And Parsons and Foreman become known as the powder monkeys, because they're always getting into this mischief. They're always playing around with explosives. And of course, he and Foreman continue to get into mischief. Their backyard, of course, is the site for these amateur explosions, and his mother kind of gets to the point where the backyard's filled with all these potholes and craters, and she decides that she's going to send Jack off to a military academy, thinking that maybe this would teach him some discipline. Without Ed, though, Parsons loses kind of like his defender against bullies. So at the military academy, to kind of impress the other kids, I guess, Parsons decides to blow up all of the bathrooms at the academy at the same time. Of course, he gets kicked out of the school, he's sent back home, and he and Foreman reunite. Parsons also, interestingly, at the age of 13 years old, would develop a correspondence with one 17-year-old Werner von Braun. They would exchange letters, like pen pals, and they would talk on the phone. He was a very rebellious person. He had a very independent streak. One might say he was kind of like oppositionally defiant, you know, even as a young kid. And this stays with him as he grows into an adult. This feeling of needing to have freedom to kind of do as he pleased. And he likes blowing things up. And he learns by doing, not through formal education. And then, of course, when the Depression begins, Jack was traveling abroad with his mother at the time, touring Europe. And so after the Depression happens, I mean, his family pretty much loses the vast majority of their wealth. And so this, for Jack, who, think about the childhood that he had, this idyllic childhood at this big mansion on Millionaire's Row, you know, cedar-lined house filled with books, and, you know, he's got wait staff, servants, a chauffeured limousine, a daily allowance. Like, he's never really had struggle before in his life. So for him, this is a shocking and humbling experience, you know, to go from such opulence to basically losing everything and having nothing. And of course, his grandparents pass away, and the family never recovers from the prominence that they once enjoyed. And I think that that experience was very jarring for the young Jack. So he's forced to kind of go to work for the first time. This is the early 1930s. He goes to work for a company called the Hercules Powder Company, and this company manufactures gunpowder, dynamite, things like that. And his buddy, Ed Foreman, ends up getting a job at Hercules as well. And the two of them begin using the company's supplies to continue with their, backyard experiments. Parsons, of course, was the visionary, and Foreman would kind of be the builder and take Parsons' ideas and basically turn them into a reality. And Foreman's father, if I recall correctly, is an engineer. And so this was, very interesting to him. Parsons continued to advance at Hercules. Parsons and Foreman discovered that they're not the only ones with this obsession with rocketry. This is, at the time, rocketry is not taken seriously by mainstream science. It is viewed with skepticism, and most scientists of that day think that this is stuff from science fiction that is for kids. They're not thinking that this is going to eventually be a reality. And I want to stress that, of how kind of ridiculed this idea was that you could take a rocket and send somebody up into space. Of course you couldn't do that. That's crazy. That was the thinking at the time. But there were a few other people who did share their interest in rocketry. One of these groups was called the International Planetary Society, and they had almost launched a rocket using something other than black powder. Parsons and Foreman see this, and they think that they could improve on it, and they begin work on liquid rocket fuel. During this time, Parsons attends briefly Stanford University. He does not get a degree. Jack is essentially a self-taught chemist. He is an alchemist. His interest in explosives leads to that interest in rocketry, which, again, at that time is considered like a dead end. It is not taken seriously. And with rocketry, you need to have a controlled explosion. And this is really where Parsons kind of makes his mark. You need to have strong explosive force, but you can't just have these things exploding on the runway. So in the mid-30s, he's drawn into the orbit of other prominent folks of his time that are trying to kind of work out this problem. He's hanging around with Gaussett folks. These are the people from the Guggenheim Aeronautics Laboratory. By 1933, Parsons constructed his first solid fuel rocket engine. And again, this is somebody he doesn't ever obtain a degree in anything. He kind of bounces around, like I said, between various colleges, but this is a self-taught guy, and he's really competing at the highest levels with highly trained scientists. So although he is not formally trained as a scientist, but he's got this talent, this starts to get recognized. And there's a man named Theodore von Karman who kind of takes an interest in Jack. In 1936, Jack, who's around 21 at that time, shows up with his buddy Ed Foreman at Caltech, wanting to build space rockets. The Gaussett project is initiated under von Karman, with Frank Molina, Jack Parsons, and Ed Foreman initially being the key individuals that will make up that group. And of course, money being always an issue, Parsons and Foreman later take jobs at the Halifax Powder Company in the Mojave Desert. Von Karman kind of becomes Jack's mentor. Theodore is of a Hungarian Jewish background, and he has a background that he has a history that is a little shady, a little sketchy. He was a member of the ill-fated Hungarian communist regime. He was like a card-carrying member of the Hungarian Communist Party in the past. And in the 30s, Parsons becomes part of this group around Caltech that becomes to be known as the Suicide Squad. It's this group of kids who would experiment by themselves, and they'd go out to the Arroyo Seco to do these experiments with controlled explosions. And sometimes these rockets would just blow up. Like, this was dangerous, and they caused a lot of mischief at the school. That's why they had to start going out into the desert, because during one of these explosions, a piece of metal got thrown into the building and like stuck into the building. So they're like, okay, you guys can still do your little experiments, but you got to do it off campus, because this isn't gonna work for us. So Parsons is basically, this is how they get their name, the Suicide Squad, because what they're doing is very dangerous. You could blow yourself up. Parsons is at the front of this group. He's a risk taker, but he manages to survive without losing any limbs. In 1938, the United States Army offered 2 research projects. Okay, so one of these projects is for a windshield de-icing of an aircraft, and the other was for rocket engines to launch small aircraft. MIT was the first university they approached, so they got to take their pick. And again, at this time, rocket science is considered goofy, woo-woo stuff, and so they declined to take that. They picked the windshield de-icing, and so the research into rocketry was given to the members of the Suicide Squad to develop. Early tests of the rocket engines relied on powdered fuel, but due to the contents of the canister setting, so when you mix this stuff up together, it eventually separates out, and that was the problem with trying to store this stuff safely. It makes it very unstable. It would be like trying to mix water and oil, and then when you let it sit, it starts separating out. So you need a binding agent, right? Parsons, who already had a passion for mythology as a kid, remember, he's this big reader. He spends his time, not just reading science fiction, but reading all of these mythology books that his mom has around the house. And so he has this background, and he starts thinking about ways to fix this solution with rocket propellant, or with rocket fuel. And he is supposedly at the school, and he's watching a roofer who's working and putting tar, like hot tar, on the top of a building. So he sees this, and he's like, oh, that reminds me of this story I read when I was a kid. And it was a book called Greek Fire, about this incendiary weapon used by the ancient Byzantine Empire. This is really like old school alchemy. So he's thinking back to his earlier experiments of using binding agents. And, he was screwing around with glue and whatnot. He decides to mix some of this tar, it's like asphalt, with potassium tetrachloride powder. And after several experiments, it is demonstrated that this binding agent provided a clean and even burn, and it could allow the canisters to be stored without the contents separating and settling. So in 1938, the Army Air Corps becomes very interested in their research. Hap Arnold appears at the Aerojet Laboratory in Pasadena, wanting to know if they could help them with the problem of airstrips, which were too short for takeoff of modern military planes. Also around this time, Parsons marries a woman that he met at believe it or not, a church dance named Helen Northrup. He's still dabbling in the occult, though, as well. This is, his private personal interest. And by the end of the 1930s, Parsons becomes a Crowley acolyte. Through a friend that he had, he had come across a book by Aleister Crowley, and this sparks his interest even more. He'd already had that kind of, as a child, that budding interest in the occult, and so he reads Crowley and he really starts getting into this more. And he and his friends from the Suicide Club or Suicide Squad, I've heard it referred to as both, they start attending a discussion group. And this is supposed to be like a group of people, academics, scientists, kind of getting together to talk politics. But the group is actually run by the Communist Party. Sidney Weinbaum from Caltech and Frank Oppenheimer are running this discussion group. Of course, Frank being the brother of Robert. The group turns into number 132 Communist Party, whose goal was to recruit influential people from academia, science, and engineering. Parsons, Foreman, and Molina basically are all part of this group. So Parsons makes contact with the OTO, the Ordo Templi Orientis, and the AA. These are Crowley organizations. So Parsons makes contact with the OTO and the AA around this time. These are organizations that are run by basically Aleister Crowley. And in December 1938, while visiting the Agape Lodge of the OTO in California, he is taken by one of his fellow scientists. So they attend together. This was his first time attending one of these lodges. And at that time, the Agape Lodge used to give these weekly performances of a perverted event that was called the Gnostic Catholic Mass. Seeing this as both a sacrament and a recruiting front, so it had two purposes, right? This mass that they would hold, this heretical mass. The Agape Lodge was, by then, like a moderately thriving and expanding organization, having been founded in the mid-1920s by a gentleman named Wilfred T. Smith, who was an English expat. Smith had many years earlier been an associate of Charles Stansfield Jones, also known as Frater Akkad, another Crowley acolyte in Vancouver, Canada. Also in 1938, an LA police captain was arrested for trying to murder a private detective. The detective had dug up some dirt on police corruption. So the captain planted a pipe bomb in his car. It exploded, but it didn't kill the detective, and so the captain was put on trial for murder. And as a local explosives expert, Parsons becomes the trial star witness. He even built a replica pipe bomb and blew up a Chrysler, and the press loved this. You have that famous picture of him holding up the pipe bomb. So he's making a name for himself, and it doesn't hurt, of course, that at that point Parsons is 6'2", he's handsome with jet black hair, and he has this little mustache. During his testimony, he basically, people just believed everything he said because he's this really smart guy, clearly an expert. So that testimony was very damning, and he ended up sending this crooked police captain to prison. And this event kind of makes him like a minor local celebrity. And the next year, in 1939, Parsons, with his now wife Helen Northrup, end up formally joining the Los Angeles, Pasadena branch of the OTO, the Agape Lodge, which, as we said, was headed by Wilfred Smith. Smith and his wife, Regina Call, have an interesting way of like recruiting members to their organization. You know, they use techniques of sexual seduction, according to member Lewis T. Culling. They had this kind of a routine that they would go through. You know, you'd have inquirers basically coming in, and they kind of use like the swinging lifestyle as a means to entice people into joining. Smith would basically sleep with all of the women, and his wife would sleep with all of the men. That's sort of how they got people to join their group. So both Parsons were initiated into the OTO in 1939. And like many entrants of the time, they joined the AA as well. Parsons took as his motto, Thelema obtentum procedero amoris nuptiae, a hybrid phrase which apparently conveys the intention of attaining Thelema through the nuptial of love, the initials transliterated into Hebrew, giving him his magical number 210. And later on in his life, he would begin to sign his letters with just the number 210. So this is all going on. All of his occultism and magical stuff is going on at the same time he is doing the high level rocket science. And they're doing these rocket tests, and Parsons, every time they would do one of these tests, he's like walking around and he recites this poem of Crowley's called the Hymn to Pan. So you can imagine, this is the 1930s, like this isn't the 60s. It is a very conservative time, you know, in still a very Christian society. So for other people who are around, they're watching this guy walking around these test sites chanting these hymns. I mean, that's got to be very weird. Parsons is also attending USC at night at this time, and he ends up dropping out of school to basically dedicate himself more to Thelema and the OTO. Around the 1940s, the Army Air Corps takes over sponsorship of the Galset project. Parsons spends most of his time developing the JTOW units. This is the jet assisted takeoff, because remember, rocket science is still kind of viewed skeptically at the time, so they don't want to call it anything rocket related, so they come up with this jet assisted takeoff. And most of the JTOW patents are in Parsons' name. Returning to the events of the 40s, the explosions of many of Parsons' rockets on the test caused second thoughts among many people involved in the government finance project. After work by von Karman and Molina on the differential equations involved on the theoretical side, Parsons is given permission to continue going with his tests, and a few months later, the earliest jet-assisted takeoff rockets were created. These were the direct forerunners to the modern, large, solid propellant engines. The first American rocket-assisted takeoff occurs on August 12, 1941, and it made use of Parsons' developed solid propellant, Galset 27, which provided a 28-pound maximum thrust for 12 seconds. But tests showed Galset 27 would explode when stored for long periods, so Parsons, Mills, and Miller come up with a more stable fuel in June of 1942. At the same time, others were working with Parsons' idea for a red fuming nitric acid gasoline engine, a liquid propellant rocket. On April 15, 1942, the first American flight of an aircraft making use of such rocket engines to assist takeoff was accomplished. The previous month, Molina, Parsons, and Foreman, with the advice of von Karman's lawyer, had set up a company called the Aerojet Engineering Corporation. This is in March of 1942, and it is for the express purpose of properly exploiting the developments that the team had been making. Parsons was one of the vice presidents at the time of incorporation and helped supervise the changeover to full-scale production. Kenneth Grant, in The Magical Revival, describes Parsons as such: imbued with the idea of the kingly man, as that expression is understood in the Cult of Thelema, Crowley's invention, Parsons bent his not inconsiderable energies, physical and intellectual, to the discovery of his true will. Michael Hoffman writes in Alchemical Conspiracy and the Death of the West of Parsons and the OTO, quote, "The Ordo Templi Orientis had a temple on nearby Mount Palomar. The local Indians regarded the mountain as holy. The OTO believed that Palomar was the sexual chakra of the earth. Parsons commuted regularly between Palomar and Pasadena. The Mount Palomar Observatory opened in 1949. Smith, who headed up the Agape Lodge, probably consecrated his temple on Palomar soon after his move to California in 1930, before the observatory was planned. Palomar lies just minutes north of the 33rd parallel. This is significant because 33 is an important number in Masonic symbolism. It is the number of the highest grade of the Scottish Rite. It is also the number of years Christ walked on the earth. Hoffman mentions the 33 bones of the human spinal cord. This brings to mind Kundalini Yoga. Crowley's OTO was a quasi-Masonic order. The higher grades show esoteric Hindu influences of a sexual nature," unquote. Parsons first meets Wilfred Smith in 1939, of course joining the Agape Lodge formally in 1941. Parsons was to be its head briefly during the 40s. Smith wrote to Crowley in March of 1941, "I think I have at long last a really excellent man, John Parsons. In starting next Tuesday, he begins a course of talks with a view to enlarging our scope. He has an excellent mind and much better intellect than myself. John Parsons is going to be valuable," unquote. Now, actress Jane Wolfe, who had been with Crowley before in Italy, where he had previously set up residence before getting kicked out by local authorities before coming to California. So she is somebody who has spent time with Crowley before. And she ends up, moving in, joining this LA OTO lodge. She records her first impression of Parsons in her magical record for December 1940. She writes, "Unknown to me, John Whiteside Parsons, a newcomer, began astral travels. This knowledge decided Regina Call to undertake similar work, all of which I learned after making my own decision, so the timing must be propitious. Incidentally, I take Jack Parsons to be the child who shall behold them all, i.e. the mysteries, see the Book of the Law. 26 years of age, 6'2", vital, potentially bisexual at the very least, University of the State of California in Caltech, now engaged in Caltech chemical laboratories developing bigger and better explosives for Uncle Sam. Travels under sealed orders from the government. Writes poetry, sensuous only, he says. Lover of music, which he seems to know thoroughly. I see him as the real successor of Therion," that is Crowley, one of the names he took for himself. So she sees him as Crowley's true magical heir, passionate, and has made the vilest analyses result in a species of exaltation after the event, has had mystical experiences which gave him a sense of equality all around, although he is hierarchical in feeling and in the established order. So that was her first impressions of Parsons that she writes, to Crowley to tell him about. In 1942, Parsons, von Karman, and others create Aerojet to sell the JTOW units to the Army Air Corps. Parsons leaves his position as head of solid fuel rocket research at the Army Air Corps Jet Propulsion Research Project to take a similar position at Aerojet. In March, Jane Wolfe writes to Crowley, "I believe Jack Parsons, who is devoted to Wilfred, to be the coming leader." She goes on to note that he was solid on the Book of the Law because it foretold Einstein, Heisenberg, whose work is not permitted in Russia, the quantum field folks, whose work is along the factor infinite and unknown lines, etc. Parsons had come to believe very much in magic, a force that he felt could be explained through quantum physics. Parsons' father ends up passing away and, as the story goes, leaves him a mansion. And this mansion is in the same affluent area of Pasadena where Parsons grew up as a child, on Millionaire's Row. So Parsons begins renting out rooms of this mansion to atheists and bohemians. And you can imagine, right? This is a very well-to-do area. They're not going to be wanting these weirdos hanging around. The frequent visitors, noisy parties, and questionable goings-on raised many eyebrows. Like, the police were getting called all the time. They're blasting music. They're dancing naked. There's all kinds of weirdness going on. And you have to remember, this is like the 1940s. It is a very different time. So back then, that was considered very strange behavior. Parsons needs the extra income that these renters pay, and this becomes known, this kind of commune, if you will, as the parsonage. Alva Rogers was a longtime resident of the Parsons house, and she wrote, "Mundane souls were unceremoniously rejected as tenants. There was a professional fortune teller and seer who always wore appropriate dresses and decorated her apartment with symbols and artifacts of arcane lore. There was a lady, well past middle age, but still strikingly beautiful, who claimed to have been, at various times, the mistress of half the famous men of France. There was a man who'd been a renowned organist in the great movie palaces of the silent era. They were characters all. From the rent they paid, Jack admitted that he was one of Crowley's main sources of money in America." So he's basically renting out these rooms to these weird people, collecting funds from them, and then just sending that money to Crowley in the UK. In July of 1943, Crowley decides he wants to get rid of Smith, who is leading the Agape Lodge at the time, and he wants to appoint Parsons as head of the lodge. But he's got problems doing this because, remember, Smith is the one actually running the lodge in California, and Crowley is not able to come to America, so he's not there personally to oversee things. Now, they all write him letters and correspond with him, but he doesn't have the kind of influence he would have if he was, like, physically there. So he's got to do some maneuvering because most of the people there are loyal to Smith, including Parsons himself. Crowley writes an Agape Lodge member named Max Schneider, quote, "As to Jack, I think he is perfectly all right at the bottom of everything, but he is very young." In a letter of May 1943 to a member called Roy Leffingwell, Crowley also wrote, quote, "I think that Smith is quite hopeless." He did not like Smith. "I am quite satisfied with what you say about his reactions to your family. It is all very well, but Smith has apparently nothing else in his mind. He appears to be using the order as a happy hunting ground for affairs. You say the same thing, and I have no doubt that it is quite correct. I think we must get rid of him once and for all, and this will include the Parsons, unless they disassociate themselves immediately from him without reservation. So Crowley at this time is, he's trying to make Smith anathema. He's trying to do this Machiavellian maneuvering behind the scenes to oust Smith, but without basically upsetting the whole lodge, and most of them are loyal to Smith at the time. So in knowing that the Parsons are too, he's saying, look, we'll just kick them out if they don't cut off contact. Now, Helen Parsons, Jack's wife at the time, is having an affair with Smith, supplanting Smith's own wife, Regina Call, as the priestess in their public performances of their heretical Gnostic Mass. Parsons is still loyal to Smith despite this situation, because part of their demonic religion is kind of like the idea, they're basically doing polyamory at this lodge. That's what they were doing at the time. They're all living together, they're engaging in this swinger type behavior, and part of their so-called religion is that they think that things like jealousy, these normal human emotions, are base emotions that they are too good for. So, apparently Parsons is fine with his wife having an affair with Smith, and that's the situation. Crowley wants to get rid of Smith, but he also, he knows that Parsons isn't really the ideal choice to replace him, but he's kind of all they've got. In a letter of July 1943 to Max Schneider, Crowley writes, "As to Jack, I think he's perfectly all right with everything, but he is young and has at present nothing like the strength to deal with matters within his jurisdiction objectively." And to give you some insight into Parsons' mind at the time in 1943, Parsons had penned the following poem. He writes, "I hight Don Quixote. I live on peyote, marijuana, morphine, and cocaine. I never know sadness, but only a madness that burns at the heart and the brain. I see each charwoman ecstatic, inhuman, angelic, demonic, divine. Each wagon a dragon, each beer mug a flagon that brims with ambrosial wine." So he's talking about doing a lot of substances there. So that can give you a mind for what is going on in this bizarre parsonage. Also at this time, Parsons and Helen finally divorce, but they still remain on friendly terms. In 1944, Crowley writes to lodge members Mr. and Mrs. Burlingham, quote, "I am very glad indeed of your offer to cooperate practically in any way possible. I have left Jack Parsons in charge. He is quite all right in essence, but very young and easily swayed by passing influences. I shall look to you to help in keeping him up to the mark." Around 1944, Helen Parsons' younger sister, Sarah, who is known as Betty, her middle name was Elizabeth, and people just called her Betty, moves in with Parsons. And this is her younger half-sister. So Parsons' ex-wife's younger half-sister moves in. And I should add, she's like underage at this point. She's 17 years old. Parsons, Theodore von Karman, and others at the same time found the Jet Propulsion Laboratory near the Devil's Gate Dam in the Arroyo Seco, nearby the location of their early rocket tests, and Parsons and Betty begin having a relationship. Yes, while she is still underage. Also, in the 40s, science fiction writer Robert Heinlein is living near the infamous Laurel Canyon. He ends up making the acquaintance of Jack Parsons. Quote, as the worlds of science and science fiction continued to coalesce, so Parsons himself was spending more time in the company of professional science fiction writers. He had become a regular guest of the Manana Literary Society, a group of authors who met at the Laurel Canyon home of writer Robert Heinlein. Lean and intelligent, with a pencil-thin mustache and a penchant for ascots, Heinlein was the swiftly winning fame as the preeminent writer in science fiction. When Parsons first met him in 1942, he was 35 years old, having begun his career late as a science fiction writer. He had spent some time in the Navy before being invalidated out of the service, and he had gone on to a brief career in politics, which culminated in a run for the California State Assembly as a member of Upton Sinclair's left-wing Epic End Poverty in California movement. Beaten by the Republican incumbent, he turned to the pulps for quick money, and now, along with Isaac Asimov and L. Sprang de Camp, was rewriting the rules of the traditional science fiction story, crafting realistic characters and beautifully wrought depictions of the future. His story of lone geniuses as proficient with their fist as with their slide rules proved remarkably popular in the pages of the pulps, and his fame would only increase in the post-war years when he published such best-selling novels as Starship Troopers and Stranger in a Strange Land. Heinlein met Parsons at a meeting of the Los Angeles Science Fiction Society as one of the earliest members of the American Interplanetary Society, the first rocket society in America, and he was impressed by the free-thinking rocket scientist and invited him to the Manana Society, so named for all the stories that would be written tomorrow. Here, some of the finest science fiction pulp writers of the time met to drink cheap sherry and talk over new stories. Those present included William White, also known by the name Anthony Boucher, and 100 other pseudonyms, whose murder mystery stories were infused with Catholic iconography. Cleve Cartmill, a beat reporter crippled from polio, whose atomic bomb story would so alarm the Manhattan Project, had already met Parsons and visited the OTO. Jack Williamson, who also knew Parsons, could be found in a corner of the room mulling over stories that mixed parallel time streams with Amazonian dominatrixes from the future. Visiting guests from outside LA would also appear at the Society's meetings. L. Ron Hubbard, who could type 2,000 words an hour without revision, and who seemed like a character in some of his dazzling tales of psychic powers and strong-jawed supermen. The film director Fritz Lang, whose early German picture Die Drau im Mond and Metropolis had been two of the earliest science fiction films, and Lang's fellow German expatriate Willy Ley, who was now doing his best to popularize the idea of space travel through his factual science articles in the pulps, astounding science fiction and amazing stories. Into this eclectic group came Parsons with his talk of rocketry and magic. This comes from George Pendle's Strange Angel, pages 228 to 230. And so Parsons, he likes this group of science fiction writers because at the time, again, rocketry is still viewed with skepticism by the mainstream scientific establishment. And when he goes to these science fiction events, he's taken more seriously, and he's around people who kind of see him for maybe the kind of visionary and brilliant person that he is. So he fits in very well with these people. And remember, Parsons has a long time love of science fiction. And so it appears that the Manna Society may have spurred the first meeting between L. Ron Hubbard and Jack Parsons. Hubbard, being a formal naval officer, would go on to found the Church of Scientology. And later in his life, when the stories of his association with Parsons and the occult comes out, he would tell people that he'd befriended Parsons as part of an operation for naval intelligence to break up Parsons' group. And it's interesting that Heinlein also was Navy. So Parsons is surrounded by a lot of people with ties to the Navy. And keep that in mind as we progress through the story in part 2. Writing to Crowley, Parson said of Hubbard, I deduced that he is in direct touch with some higher intelligence. He is the most thelemic person I have ever met, and is in complete accord with our own principles. So he, Parsons is a bit naive, and this is his first perception of L. Ron Hubbard, who has been described by many people as a very, the kind of person that he either charmed you or repulsed you. Some people were instantly repulsed by L. Ron, some people were instantly charmed, and Parsons was the latter. So he thinks that Hubbard was the most thelemic person, meaning somebody who basically knows a lot about, he's very much in accordance with what the Thelemites believe. And I believe that by that point, L. Ron Hubbard had already been familiar with Crowley and his writings, and I think that that's what Parsons is referring to about he is the most thelemic person I have ever met. He's in accordance with our principles. I believe that, when Parsons meets Hubbard, mind you, this is at these science fiction meetings, Hubbard is kind of like the only other person who's familiar with Crowley's works there. And so for Parsons, this is his big thing. It's like finding another person who, likes your favorite band or, your whatever. This is like a nerd thing for him. Like, oh, finally, there's somebody else who, like, understands and gets me. So on this basis, L. Ron Hubbard is then invited to stay at the parsonage in the house, and apparently was initiated into the secrets of the OTO. After moving into the parsonage, Hubbard is a very shady character. He's a bit of like a huckster. He's going around and he's essentially going through all of the women in the place. And at this point, remember, Parsons is having a relationship with the younger half-sister of his former wife, Helen, Sarah, who is known by Betty. And Betty starts to take up an interest in Hubbard. This, of course, makes Parsons incredibly jealous, and he starts to delve deeper into the occult, into witchcraft. He becomes very interested and fascinated by, like, poltergeists and ghosts. So he's doing these rituals all the time at this house. And he is, you have to imagine, he's up in his, I think they say he was doing it in his room on the 3rd floor. So he's in this big mansion. He's in this room. He has it dark. He lights some candles. He draws a pentagram on the floor of the room. He puts on his black OTO robe. He's got a consecrated dagger and he's chanting for hours. He's speaking in Enochian. He's going into English. And these are elaborate rituals. And apparently, allegedly, he starts trying to, invoke entities that he's really trying to do something to Hubbard, who's basically moved into his house, is living there for free, and basically stole his girlfriend. But of course, Parsons has to pretend to be totally cool with that, or he basically risks exposing himself as not really believing in all of the things he had espoused up until that point. And he's basically the leader of the OTO at that time after the ouster of Wilfred Smith, who Crowley maneuvers out by writing a book for him called Liber 132, where he tells him that he is a god and he's got to go into like magical retirement and he has to go through this book and discover his godhood or whatever. It's nonsense. It was just to get him out of the house, but to kind of appease the people who were still loyal to him, including Parsons himself, who reluctantly, becomes the leader of the lodge. And so people who are living there begin to experience weird phenomenon. While he has these issues with Hubbard, who is basically, taken his girl, who's kind of infatuated with Hubbard at the time, Parsons still sees Hubbard as a valuable member of the organization, essentially. He still sees him as a valuable person to have around. He says to other people that of all the people there, he thinks that L. Ron Hubbard is the most psychically gifted. So he doesn't get rid of him, but there is tension there, and Parsons kind of is spiraling in a sense. He's just going more and more into the occult and into magic, and because he's a scientist, he is much more outcome-oriented than Crowley, for example. Crowley tells people that basically a lot of the whole ceremonial magic thing is to kind of induce like an altered state of consciousness, and that it's really about becoming, elevating your consciousness, and he sees these things as kind of like mental things that are conjured up by the subconscious, if you will. So Crowley has a different view of magic than Parsons. Parsons, being a scientist, is the kind of person who he's approaching magic in a scientific way. He wants to see results, and he doesn't really care about the different rituals and summonings that he's doing. He just wants to see some kind of physical response. He wants to have a physical manifestation, something that he can look at that would confirm to him that magic is real. And so he starts really going into these rituals with, trying to get this kind of activity. And really, he's a true believer in magic in a different way than some of the other occultists who are more kind of like confidence men themselves. He is a true believer, and other people who live at the lodge in LA, they claim to have experienced this like poltergeist activity that would happen when he'd be up there doing his rituals for hours. And he's lighting incense, he's playing music, he's doing all this weird, and I hate to tell you this, but he's like jerking off in a chalice while waving around his dagger and chanting incantations. Like, he's doing really weird stuff. And apparently at one point he must have summoned something, and apparently all of the electricity went out in the house, and L. Ron Hubbard was down in the kitchen, and he lets out this scream. He's like, ah, and here Parsons comes running in with his consecrated dagger, wearing his robe, and he says that he saw a light that was brown and yellow, like hovering above Hubbard, who apparently lost the use of his arm for the rest of the night, like had his arm paralyzed or something for the rest of that night. And this is something that really kind of confirms to Parsons that he's on the right track, and he apparently does a banishing ritual and banishes the apparition. And so this is the backdrop of what is going on before Parsons and Hubbard begin the infamous Babylon working. And so we'll end it here today, and we will pick up on part 2. We'll begin that with the Babylon working. And so I'm interested to know what you guys think, of course. I hope you guys can begin to see why I thought it might be interesting to tell you all this story if you aren't familiar with it, because this is the real history behind our space program. I mean, think about satellites. Those would not be in space right now without the rocket technology that Parsons created, the entire modern world basically is influenced by this man that has been confined to the margins of history because of how weird he was. And this is the real history, you know? So I'm interested to know what you guys think, and I hope you all have a good day.